So another short intro today because you can't really see the project if I'm holding it. This is the box I'm making to store these two pipes inside. Now I thought this was going to be one video, but I'm ending up doing some more intricate things on this, like a veneer top, and I'm starting to make these little rests for the pipes to sit in. So all of that's taking a little bit longer than I thought. It's also turning into more video footage. So the first part of the video will take you up to about this part, and then I'll finish it up next week. But that's basically what this video is going to entail for today. A half-finished cigar pipe box. So stuff like this I like to make out of scrap, and I just finished a project that used some plank cedar. I really liked the way it finished with some clear coat on it, so I decided to use that for the basic structure of the box. Now I wanted to put dovetails on all the ends as my joinery method. I decided to use the dovetailing machine I have because it's just faster than cutting them by hand. So in order to do that, I had to rip this down because I didn't want it to be a big bulky box, and the thinnest material I could cut on that machine is 1/2 inch. So that's what I cut this to. You can see I'm removing the rounded over edges, so I have nice square edges, and then I'm just going to set this up with my tall fence in place. This material is about 1 inch thick, so I'm essentially cutting it in half, of course losing 1/8 of an inch because of the thickness of the blade. So I'll be left with 2 sections, and like I said, I'm using the section that's 1/2 inch. So this material is 5.5 inches with the 2 edges, little bit of edges removed. It's a little bit thinner than that. So I go about 2.5 inches on each pass, and then that will split it in half. So like I said, one of these is going to be 1/2 inch. The other one's a little less than that. I'm going to put it to the side and actually use a chunk of this in later in the project. So I'm roughing this out. I'm not working off of plans or anything. So roughly, I believe it was 12 inches long, and the sides were about 6 inches was what I cut this all down to. And that was based on the size of the pipes, but also the plank of lumber I have. So you can see I'm just rough cutting this all down, and then I could start cutting dovetails into these. So I'm leaving these tall. I haven't decided how high I wanted the box to be at, so that's why it looks pretty tall at this point. When using this dovetail jig, once you get it dialed in, it works really well, but especially when you're changing the thickness of the material, you have to change settings on the jig. So you can see I did multiple test pieces in order to get a nice tight fit before using my final pieces. But this jig, like I said, it could be a little bit of a pain to set up because I usually have it set up for 3/4 inch material, so I had to make some adjustments to set it up for 1/2 inch material. But once you get it dialed in, you can very quickly put dovetails on all of my pieces. So that is basically how it's going to cut it. The pins and the tails are cut at the same time, so then this corner will mate up perfectly. Another reason I kept it long is the edge. You usually have some blowout with the router bit, so it's long enough that I won't have to worry about that. But this obviously will be one corner. I'll just go around and keep making the corners. The fit's pretty tight. There's a little bit of hairline gaps, but all that stuff will close when I put this in clamps to glue it up. So like I said, there's one corner, and then I'll cut the opposite end of the front. You can see the new side, so this is the one I'm going to cut next. I like to keep it oriented like this because if you flip your pieces around, obviously you have to start from scratch. It's pretty important to keep them lined up. So I make sure I have the piece on the bottom facing out, just like on the top before I cut. And the top piece looks a little bit longer, but because this is short, it was shimming up the piece. So I actually have 2 pieces of there holding the clamp down. It's pretty simple. I go in a couple passes to avoid as much tear out as possible. You can see that one piece cuts the tails, and then the pins up top. You can see I had the 2 pieces in place in order to get the clamp in there without making it flare out. Then I'll put it together, and then like I said, I use it this way so I'm always making sure I'm cutting the same corners and I'm not flipping them around. So it could take a little bit of time. You could see lining it all up, making sure it's perfect. But once again, cutting, especially if you're doing, I usually don't pull this out for one project because it sometimes ends up taking just as much time as hand cutting. But if I'm doing multiple drawers, this thing is such a time saver. And then that is how all those pieces go together. So I have dovetails in all the corners. Now I didn't properly adjust my side shims on the jig, so this was a little bit, you could see a little bit proud on certain spots. So all I'm doing on the table saw is squaring up the bottom of the box. If you set up your jig properly, you won't have to do this. They'll be flush. So once the bottom's squared up, I could square up the top, and I'm also removing those blowout sections at the same time. So like I said, I could square up the top once the bottom's squared up. And this will still get cut down a little bit, but like I said, I was building this as I went, so I hadn't totally decided on how tall I wanted it to be. So at this point, I mark outside and bottom of all my pieces because I'm going to be putting a bottom on this box using 1/2" birch veneer ply because that's what I had lying around the shop. So the blue tape just helps me orient it as I'm cutting on the table saw. I have a 1/2" dado jig in there, and I'm going about 1/4 inch into the piece. Now on these ones you could ride it all the way through and the dado won't show, but on the short sides you could see I'm lowering it onto the dado stack and only cutting in between the pins, otherwise it will have tear out. So once it's together, you could see there's a little bit of a flange there because I lowered it onto the blade. So I'll just have to remove that with a chisel. Now, like I said, on these long sides right here, what I'm doing, you can cut this all the way through, which I'll show later because the tail's covered by the pins. But on the short sides, you can't. It'll blow out the front side of the box if you remove that material. So then I measured the inside of my frame. And then I added 3/16 because I ended up cutting that dado 3/16. So these are my original measurements. I'm adding actually 3/8 because I have to 3/16 on both sides. And that is my final measurement on the piece of paper for the bottom. So I could just rip that down to size and then use my radial arm saw to cut it and dry fit it into place. Like I said, sometimes I'll use 1/4 inch on this bottom, but I didn't have any, so I just used 1/2 inch. Then I roughly placed those pipes in there and I measured the height. Now the top is going to be pretty thick in and of itself, so I made sure to account for that. And you could see I made a mark there. Basically, I think going down, I think it was 1.5 inches. So I just set up the fence in order to do that, and then I ripped off the top, which will essentially be the final height. So this little bit on the top I won't use. So then the top for this, I wanted to do something a little different. A lot of times I'll put a raised panel on the top, which I like the way it looks, but I wanted to play around with some veneer on the top. So I was going to put a 1/2 inch top in here, but I'm measuring wrong. I measured on the inside of the blade a 1/2 inch where I should have measured on the outside. So once I made this 1/2 inch dado cut, it was actually 3/4 inch down. It wasn't a huge deal. I just used 3/4 inch plywood for the top instead of 1/2 inch, but that was a mistake there. You can see same thing. I have to lower these pieces onto the blade in order to get that cut on the top, and that's only a 1/4 inch groove because you'll see how I'm going to sink the plywood for the top. So like I said, I had to make this out of 3/4 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this the same size as the base, accounting for the fact that that dado is 3/16 inch all the way around the box. So you're adding 3/8 inch to both of your measurements. And then here I'm marking that 3/16 all the way around because I'm going to put rabbets around this whole box down to, and leave a 1/4 inch on the bottom. That 1/4 inch on the bottom will fit into the 1/4 inch dado I cut into the box. So you'll see why I had to use 3/4 inch instead of a 1/2 inch plywood for this. It's a very simple method for getting a floating panel inside a frame like that and having it flush. It's really important to use plywood for something like this because plywood won't really move around a ton on you, a bunch on you, whereas solid wood will, and it could eventually make your joints on the top of that box pop or expand. So I'm basically just have a rabbet around the whole, a 3/16 inch rabbet around the whole edge, and then you could see how this will fit into that dado on the top. So I'm pointing out how that fits in there. You kind of see it. That's a better view. And then you can see it's flush on the top. This veneer was a little water damaged, so it peeled off. I'll just fill that with some spackle before I put the veneer on it. And then you can see how the box all fits together with a nice flat top. So then for this, like I said, I wanted to use a little bit of veneer. This is a very, 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 very simple veneering technique. I didn't have time to do something super intricate, but like I said, I didn't want to use the raised panel method anymore. So I originally started by making a template out of cordboard for this. I quickly realized I could just draw this right onto my veneer because it's, like I said, a very simple design. So I overcut a piece of maple veneer, which I had lying around the shop. You can see it's just oversized of this original cordboard template I had, which is the exact same size as the top, and I'm basically just making somewhat of a sunburst in the middle, so it's just multiple points meeting in the center. They're all symmetrical, so I'm going the same distance off the edge in order to get all that. You can see what I'm doing is I obviously have my two main perpendicular axes, and then I'll split that in half. You can see I'm splitting it in half there on both sides, and then that will keep giving me the rays through the center, which create that sunburst-like effect. Now, I've never done anything like this before with veneer, so I was kind of making this up as I go, but it ended up working really well. So with a very sharp straight edge, I changed out the blade for this. I'm just going to go through and with a metal ruler, just cut through all of those lines so I get multiple pieces. Now, this is actually paper-backed veneer. I was using this for another project, so I had some laying around the shop. Like I said, this was actually ended up working out pretty well. You have to be a little careful towards all the tips because they're fairly fragile, but I didn't have a problem with breakage or anything. And since this is maple, I made sure to put pre-stain on there. Maple still doesn't take stain great even with pre-stain, but it definitely improves it. And then just to create a little bit of a two-tone look on the top, I'm staining this two different colors. I believe the first color was a cherry oak, or it might have been honey, I can't quite remember. And then the second one was Jacobean, or some people call it Jacobean. And that's a little bit of a darker brown. So there's a little bit of a reddish brown and then a darker brown. And then those are my pieces. And then I could tape this back together. This part I was surprised. I thought this was going to be rather difficult. It really wasn't. I just worked my way around. At some point I pull out a straight edge. There it is. In order to keep this pretty flat, but I just lined up my points and I lined up where the edge is, and I just worked my way around the piece, taping this all back together. And it's going to look like there's some pretty big gaps, but once you get it all taped, it really pulls together quite nicely. I was pleasantly surprised at how easy this process was. It doesn't create a very intricate veneer, but it's just enough to make the top a little more dynamic. And then once the pieces are all taped together, I go through and just cover the whole thing with tape, making sure I'm pulling all those joints together. Now, the glue I'm using for this I had in the shop, and they recommend if you're using paper vac veneer to just rough it up a little bit with 80 grit sandpaper before using the glue. So that is what I did. And then you could see I had that mark in there fixed with spackle. I just put spackle in there and then sanded it. Then I'm putting the glue on. This glue says to put a liberal coat, but still be able to see pencil marks through the glue. I could place my veneer on top, and then I could just clamp it in place overnight. Roll it down so that everything is nice and seamless. Make sure I have enough overhang around the whole thing. And then this original piece I put on the top, it didn't end up working, so I swapped this out for a piece of plywood, but I don't show that. So you can see it all clamped in place with the plywood. We'll let this set up overnight. And then the next morning I could come in. The fun part about veneer is it is kind of like a reveal once you take all that tape off. Remove all my clamps. Want to make sure you get really good. I have a vacuum press, but I wasn't going to take it out for a small veneer job like this. And then before I start taking the tape off, I wanted to trim down the extra flanges just because they're going to be pretty fragile at this point. I didn't want to rip off the top. So you can see I'm just using a straight edge to trim off the edges, and I'll final sand them so they're nice and flush. I still leave them a little long, but I didn't want to leave them too long. and then I could take off the tape. And like I said, I was pleasantly surprised with how well this lined back up for what I keep saying is a pretty simple veneer job to completely transform that top. And I'm assuming it's going to look better, even better once the clear coat is on there. And then, like I said, this is pretty much where I'm at. And then I thought this was going to be one video, but I have a lot more footage, so it's going to be two.